How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 8 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 8 is awesome. Daf 8 is awesome. There's a bunch of interesting topics in Daf 8. Here's the thing with Daf 8. Usually we have kind of this rule of thumb which tends to play out, which is when there's a lot of sections, it tends to be a long daf. Daf 8 has 6 sections, which is a lot of sections. It didn't feel like such a long daf when I was learning it, but there are 6 sections, so we'll see. But there's some interesting stuff. Also, our friend Reb Hillel Lester bought us all a gift. He bought me a gift, which in turn is us a gift. He bought me a Chullin picture book. He bought it Friday? I think he bought it for me 2 days ago, on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. Already today, we are thankful to Reb Hillel. We have some pictures all the way, it's mamish all the way at the end of the daf, like very end of the daf, mamish, like the very last section, but without the photos, without the pictures from that book, we would not be able to see what we need to see. And I have to imagine that this is only the beginning, that we are going to get a lot of great use from Hillel's gift to all of us. So thank you very much, Reb Hillel. Friends, on today's daf, section number 1, Shechita with a red hot knife. This is very, very interesting stuff. So if you do Shechita, you can't burn an animal to death. You can't just take a blowtorch and burn his neck off. You have to use a knife and slice the kana and the veshet, the trachea and the esophagus. If you use a red hot knife, is that burning or is it slicing? And interestingly, there are nafkaminas for Tzaraas. So there are nafkaminas for Tzaraas, which is interesting. Did a little bit of I wouldn't say a deep dive, somewhere in between a shallow and a deep dive yesterday into Tzaraas. Truth is, in the grand scheme of things, I did a very shallow dive, but it felt more than a shallow dive into Tzaraas a little bit. So we're actually going to talk about Tzaraas, which is a topic that is very esoteric, yet once when I was doing Shnai Mikra V'Chatargum a few weeks ago for Tazria Mitzora, I said, dang it, I don't have a handle on this stuff. I don't know that. I don't really understand what's going on with this Tzaraas stuff. But with Mishnah Yomi, we began yesterday Seder Taros. We're learning right now Masechta Kelim. After that is Oalos. After that is Negoyim. I looked at the Mishnah Yomi schedule and I said, if everything goes well, by the time Tazria Mitzora comes around next year, I will know it's flying. And Tazria Mitzora came early because on Daf Ches of Masechta Chullin, we are getting into some of the details of Tzaraas, which is great because it helps us actually make some sense of this very esoteric and abstract thing that is Tzaraas. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of a better understanding of Tzaraas today. Also related to if you hit somebody with a red hot rod, would that be shchin or would it be a michvah? So we will talk a little bit about that. Doing shechita with a knife that was used for idolatry, a knife that is asur b'hana'ah, because it was used in the context of avodah zarah. Can you or can't you use such a knife for shechita? Shechita with the knife of a non-Jew. If you use the knife of a non-Jew that was, of course, used for non-kosher stuff, and now you're going to do shechita with it, what happens? Kosher, not kosher? What can you do? Can you make it kosher? Shechita with a knife used to slaughter a tereifah. Interesting question. If you slaughter an animal, turns out to be as tereifah, and now what? You want to slaughter another animal? What happens to the knife that you just used the knife for treif? Can you use it to shecht another animal? Also, very interesting question. And finally, some laws for a shochait. Some laws that just kind of some what's that called? Assorted. I feel like that's not the word I was thinking of, but sure. What's it called when you have like a whole bunch of different stuff? Assorted works, but I feel like there's a better word. But okay, assorted laws for a shochait. And so as we have seen, there is quite a bit on this stuff, a lot of stuff. They do tend to be these little chunks, but very, very, very interesting sugyas over here on Daf 8 of Masechta Chullin. So friends, let's jump in. Let's have a great time. Let's enjoy ourselves, and let's learn Daf 8 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on Daf Ches, Amud Aleph, Masechta Chullin, all the way at the top, very beginning of the Daf. Amr Reb Zera, Amr Shmuel, says Reb Zera, in the name of Shmuel. Libain Sakin V'Shochat Ba. Very, very interesting. A person took a Shechita knife and made it red hot. Made the Shechita knife red hot, and then he slaughtered, let's say, a sheep with it. So the question is that considered a proper Shechita, right? Because Shechita is slice it, for okay, so the Mishnayos in Masechta Chullin, I believe it is the first Mishnah of the second parak of Masechta Chullin, describes that for a bird, technically you only need to cut through one of the two simanim, the two simanim being the trachea and the esophagus. For a bird, technically you only need to slice through one, or at least the majority of one of the two simanim, but really, lichatchila, I think you should slice through both. For an animal, like a cow, like a sheep, like a goat, you need to slice through at least the majority of both of the simanim, the trachea and the esophagus. Now, so, Shechita is slicing through the simanim, not burning through the simanim, slicing through the simanim. So the question is, when you have a red hot knife, when you touch that knife to the animal's throat, there's two things happening, bo zmanit, two things happening at the same time, slicing and burning. So which one do we consider it like you burnt the simanim, which is a problem, or do we treat it like you sliced through the simanim, in which case it's kosher, right? Burning puzzle, right? Burning non-kosher, literally treif, right? Because by burning, what will happen is if it's considered burning, then basically it's considered like you're making the animal a tereifah by burning it, by burning the neck, burning the esophagus, and if you're slicing it, then you're doing a proper shechita. So the question is, how do we consider it? Shechita so kshera, chiduda kodem libuna. So the Gemara says not to worry, it's a kosher shechita because the blade is slicing through the simanim before the simanim are getting burned. So as the blade slices through the trachea and the esophagus, they are being sliced before they're getting heated up to a point where they would be considered burned. So it's a kosher shechita. It's considered like you sliced through the simanim. Ba'ikat stadin. Very, very, very interesting question. A question that's a little bit tricky to explain. I was thinking about making some kind of a diagram for it. However, I was not sure exactly how I would visualize it in an easy way either. So, therefore, I am going to explain it as best as I can. Hopefully, I can explain it well enough. You will be the judge of that. Now, so basically, even if we're saying that yes, you're slicing through, as the blade slices through the trachea and the esophagus, it is slicing, the simanim are being sliced before they're being burned. But interestingly, there's also the side of the blade. There's the tip of the blade, right? Meaning the tip being the razor sharp blade, right? Where as it's cutting through the first thing that the part of the knife that is slicing through the trachea and the esophagus is the blade. But then there's the kind of height, right? There's the sides of the knife, right? The sides of the blade. That isn't the sharp end, but the kind of sides of the blade. So as you slice through the neck, so the sides of the blade are going to be right? If you imagine, like if you take, like, for example, a loaf of bread, if you take like a thick loaf of bread and you take a let's say a big bread knife, not like a thin one, but like a big tall bread knife, and you're cutting through it. So the blade is going to be, eating through the bread while it's being cut through, but there's still, the sides of the bread are going to be pressing against the sides of the knife as you're cutting through the bread, right? So if you think about that in the context of the neck, so you have this red hot knife that is slicing through the neck. And yes, the blade is slicing, but if we, for example, take this and like slow it down, if we were, for example, watching a video of this and we slow it down, so you have the blade slicing, but even before it gets to halfway through the neck, which is what would make a kosher shechita, so it's not yet a kosher shechita, and it's slicing, the sides of the knife are now touching the parts of the simanim, of the trachea and esophagus that have already been sliced through, and now it's the sides of the knife are touching the parts of the trachea and esophagus that have already been sliced through and are burning them while the blade, while the sharp edge of the blade is continuing to slice through, but it's not yet a kosher shechita because it hasn't yet sliced through more than halfway, and already the sides of the blade have already burnt the parts of the trachea and esophagus that have already been sliced through. Does that make sense? So kilu, as the point, I'm going to call the point of the blade, meaning the sharp end of the blade, or I could just say the sharp end of the blade, as the sharp end of the blade is slicing through the trachea and the esophagus and kind of covering more ground in its slicing, the rest of the blade, the sides of the blade, are still red hot and are burning the parts of the trachea and esophagus that have already been sliced through, and yet the slice is not yet halfway, so it's not yet a kosher shechita, and already you've burnt parts of the trachea and esophagus and basically made it a tereifah before you've made it a kosher shechita. That is the Gemara's question. So even if you want to say that as you're slicing, the blade is slicing through before the trachea and the esophagus get burnt by the knife, however, as the slice continues, the rest of the knife is now going to be coming into the trachea and esophagus and burning it before the shechita is halfway through and kosher. I hope that I managed to explain that well enough. So what about the sides of the knife that are going to be burning through the trachea and esophagus as the blade is cutting through at the front end, as it's leading the way? So, and for the Gemara, Beis HaShchita Mirvach Rovach. So the Beis HaShchita, basically the part where the part of the animal's neck that is being sliced through, the Beis HaShchita, where the trachea and the esophagus are, as they're being sliced through, they're basically separating, right? If you can imagine, two people holding, if you have, Reuven and Shimon are like holding a rope and like playing tug of war or something, and then you have Levi in the middle with a saw, and he's sawing through that rope. As he saws through it, because Reuven and Shimon are pulling in opposite directions, it's going to be, right, as he saws through it, the part that's been sawed through is going to be pulled to either side. It won't be touching the knife. The knife is the blade is sawing through, but because there's being pulled on either side, the part that's already been sawed through is being pulled in other directions and isn't actually touching the knife anymore because they're being pulled in opposite directions. So also the trachea and the esophagus are kind of like tight strung in that as they're cut through, as they're sliced through, they're being pulled in opposite, they're just automatically going in opposite directions. They aren't actually touching the sides of the blade anymore. So therefore, b'kitzur, if you do shechita with a red hot knife, it is kosher because the blade is going to be cutting through right before the red hotness has an opportunity to do any damage to the trachea and esophagus. And in terms of the side of the knife, immediately as the knife cuts through, it's being pulled in opposite directions and no longer touching the knife. So therefore, the shechita is a kosher shechita. And now for most of the rest of the Amud, we get into a lengthy discussion around Tzaraas in a way that relates to the sugya that we just discussed about, when you have something that is red hot in terms of burning. Let's see. They asked the question when it comes to Tzaraas, Libein Shapud Vihikabo, if Reuven takes a rod, an iron rod, and he puts it in a fire until it gets red hot through and through. And Reuven takes this red hot rod and he goes to his nemesis. I think that means like the guy he doesn't like, Shimon. And Reuven hits Shimon with this red hot rod. So by doing that, there's two things that happened here. He hit him with a rod, and by hitting him with a rod, he will get bruised, he will get hit, he will get swollen because he was hit with a rod. But this wasn't just any rod, it was a red hot rod, so he's also going to get burnt. So the question is, do we treat it like a hit or do we treat it like a burn? So again, Ibadu de Asakasha, Libein Shapud, if Ruvain took an iron rod and made it red hot, Vihikabo, and he hit Shimon with it. Mishum Shchin Nidon or Mishum Michva Nidon. Will we treat it like Shchin or will we treat it like Michva? Do. Okay. So, Bigadol, when it comes to Tzaraas, as I think most of us know, there's kind of three categories of Tzaraas. Those three categories being Tzaraas of the skin, right, on the person, right, a person gets Tzaraas, that's number one. Number two is a person's clothing gets Tzaraas, and number three is a person's house gets Tzaraas. We're talking about the Tzaraas of a person. Now, within the Tzaraas of a person, there are different categories. There's Tzaraas or a basar. That's, for example, you look at your arm or something, you're like, wow, I have a white skin disease that came out of nowhere. That's Tzaraas or a basar. That's just random Tzaraas. Another category is Tzaraas of Shchin and Michva, which is the topic of our Gemara. Let's actually get back to that in a second, since that's a topic and we're going to elaborate on it. The other type, right, so if we say that the first type is Tzaraas or a basar, the next type that we'll talk about is Tzaraas of the hair of your head, the hair of your beard, right, those kind of, right, there's that category of your head and face. And the third category that we'll discuss is Tzaraas of boils and of burns, of Shchin and of Michva. What that means is that if a person gets Shchin, boils, or if a person gets a burn, and then as the Shchin or as the Michva is healing, Tzaraas emerges from the wound. So that is what's called, and then we have to kind of check it out and go to the Kohen, that whole thing. We have to now figure out if this is Tzaraas and what to do about it. So Tzaraas that emerges from Shchin or from a Michva, that is a type of Tzaraas. Now, if a person gets hit with a rod that is not red hot, as we're going to learn about in the Gemara, if a person gets hit with something, so the inflammation that results from that could be considered Shchin. And when that's healing, if Tzaraas emerges from that, so then that would be Tzaraas of Shchin. And if a person gets burnt, and as the burn heals, so there's Tzaraas, and that would be Tzaraas of a Michva. So now, the Gemara asks, fourth line of the Amud, Ibadu Asakasha, Libein Shapud, if Ruvain made a rod red hot, Vehikabo, and he hits Shimon with it. And now, so basically Shimon, so what happened? Shimon was hit with a red hot rod, and he got a wound. And from that wound emerges Tzaraas. So Mishum Shchin Nidon or Mishum Michva Nidon. So are we going to treat the emerging Tzaraas, Shimon's emerging Tzaraas as Shchin Tzaraas or as Michva Tzaraas? L'manaf kamina, who cares? At the end of the day, the halachas of Shchin Tzaraas and Michva Tzaraas are identical. At the end of the day, the halachas of Shchin Tzaraas and Michva Tzaraas are identical, as we're going to see in a minute. So what's the difference? Who cares if it's Shchin Tzaraas or Michva Tzaraas? Lichdetanya. The difference is, like we learn in a brisa, or really several brises. Shchin u'michva, Shchin and Michva Tzaraas, mitamin b'shavua echad, are mitame after 1 week, right? We learned Tazriya, Mitzora. Well, I guess really this would probably be more in Tazriya. The whole confusing halachis of Tzaraas. The Kohen checks it out, he sends him away for a week, he comes back after a week, he sends him away for another week, comes back after the second week. It's like, okay, how many weeks is he going away for? So when it comes to Shchin Tzaraas, and when it comes to Michva Tzaraas, it's a maximum of just 1 week of being sent away. Let's go weiter for a second. Shavua echad b'shnei simanin, and there are 2 signs when it comes to, there are two identifiers of shchin and michvat tzaraas. Number one, b'seir lavan, if there are at least 2 white hairs in the tzaraas, that is an identifier of shchin or michvat tzaraas. V'pision, or if it spreads after the week. So, when it comes to, so a person has a shchin or a michvah and it's healing, and he's seeing that tzaraas is emerging. So he goes to the kohen. If the kohen sees on day 1 that there are at least 2 white hairs in this emerging tzaraas, the kohen immediately says, okay, you have tzaraas, done. Now, if, however, there wasn't yet 2 hairs, so then the kohen sends him away to quarantine outside Mechutz Lamachane for a week, and then they check again after a week. Now, if after a week either it now has at least 2 white hairs, or by the end of the week it has spread, those would be 2 indications of tzaraas. If, however, at the end of that week there were no 2 hairs and it did not spread, then he's tahor. Done. No being sent away for another week. As opposed to, this parenthetically, tzaraas or a basar, when it's not related to shchin or a burn, when just he says, wait, what's this white stuff on my skin? So if after the first week nothing has changed, so he would go away again for a second week. So different types of tzaraases have different rules about. Also, there's also if there's like if it's like healthy in the middle of the meaning each type of tzaraas has its own kind of unique details. The details of shchin, right, was it or basar achai betocha se'es or something, whatever. So that's by or basar stuff. But when it comes to michvah and shchin tzaraas, so there are 2 identifiers. That's the white hairs and if it spreads, and the final determination is going to be at the end of the first week. He won't be sent away for a second week. And that applies identically to shchin tzaraas and to michvah tzaraas. If they are identical, then why does the Torah write about them separately? Lomar, to say, she'ein mitztarfim zeh im zeh. Because they don't join together. So the minimum shi'ur for tzaraas is a grease. That's the shear. I think it's like half the size of a bean or something. So the minimum size for tzaraas is a grease. Now, if you have half a grease of shchin tzaraas and half a grease of michvah tzaraas, they won't join together and you won't have tzaraas. That is why they're written separately, to say that they don't join together to create a full shear. V'sanye, and we learn in a braisit, ezu shchin ve'ezu michvah. Now, what is considered shchin tzaraas and what would be considered michvah tzaraas? Laka ba'etz, if he got hit with wood, ba'evin, or with stone, begefes, or he stuck his hand into, if I understand this correctly, is in an olive press. I think it's like olive compost, right? So in olive press, so all of the kind of whatever's left from the olives after they're pressed, I think the point is they're then put in a pile, and the pile composts and gets really hot. If you put his hand in there and his hand got burnt from that, b'chami Tveria, or from the chami Tveria, from the hot springs of Tveria. And anything that does not come from fire, right? You get hit by a piece of wood, hit by a stone, even by putting your hands into compost, right? There's no, that heat is not coming from fire. Tosfos actually says something very interesting, which is that Rabbi Yossi says in Masechta Shabbos that the, what is it? Rabbi Yossi says that the Chami Tveria would be considered toldas ha'or. It would be considered a tolada of or because it passes by the fires of hell. But says Tosfos, even over here, it wouldn't be considered. It wouldn't, because that fire, if the Chami Tveria is getting heated up by the fires of hell, that's a fire coming from God. It's not a fire coming. It's not a man-made fire. So, in order for it to be considered shchin, right? For it to be considered shchin, we're talking about these kinds of burns or boils that did not come from anything, that there was no fire involved. You got hit by wood, you got hit by stone, you got stuck your hand into some compost, you went into the Chamet Tiveria and got burnt. Lasui Aver Meikaro, and this also includes lead, right? Lead that was mined and is hot. In all these examples, the heat was not coming from fire, and therefore Zeu Shchin. These would be considered Shchin, and any Tzaraas emerging from them would be Shchin Tzaraas. Ve'ezu Michva, what is burn Tzaraas? What is Michva Tzaraas? Nichva Bigacheles, well, there was a burning coal. Beremetz, or burning ashes. Besid, Roseach, Begivsis, right? Different types of burning lime. Roseach, that is burning hot. Uv'chol dover abamachmas, or anything that was heated up with fire. Lasui chame, or to include even hot water that was boiled with fire. Anything heated up with fire, zoi michva, that would be considered tzaraas of a burn. Okay, so you have this shrin, you have this michva, and from them emerge tzaraas. Vesanya, and we learn in a braise, shrin u'michva, im shrin kodem lemichva, bitel michva es shrin. So now, if you have shrin, and on top of that, there is a burn. You mamash get a burn right on top of the shrin, or vice versa. Or you got shrin mamash on top, right? A boil mamash on top of a burn. So shrin u'michva, when it comes to shrin and michva, to boils and burns, im shrin kodem lemichva, if the shrin was there first, followed by the michva, bitel michva es shrin. So what was there second overrides what was there first. So if the shrin was there first, followed by the michva overrides the shrin. The michva kodems the shrin, and if the michva was there first, so the shrin which came second overrides the michva. Bitel shrin es michva, so the shrin is mevatel the michva. So whatever was there second, so whatever was there first becomes overridden by whatever came second. Okay, now we're going to start soon. We're gonna start tying things together. Now, well, actually, right now we're going to start tying things together. Vehacha. Okay, now in our example, Shimon got hit by a rod, and that rod was red hot. The question is, what came first? The burn and then the blow, or the blow and then the burn? Whatever was second is going to be the overriding factor. Vehacha. And over here by the red hot rod, heichi dami, how so? What is the dili? Oh, kigon dehavabe chatzi gris. It's talking about a situation where Shimon already had chatzi gris shchin meikar. It's talking about a situation where Shimon already had half a shiur of shchin tzaraas. V'libein shapud v'hikabo, and then Ruvain heated up a red hot rod and hit Shimon. V'nafak bei chatzi gris, and now another half a shear of tzaraas emerged from that wound to join together, or potentially to join together with the existing shchin tzaraas. And the question is, can the new tzaraas that emerged from the wound join together with the existing shchin tzaraas? So as we said earlier, shchin and michva don't join together. So in order for the new half gris to join with the existing shchin half gris, the new half gris is going to have to be shchin tzaraas as well. So now what do we say? Do we say chabata kodim? Do we say that the blow, that when Ruvain hit Shimon with a red hot rod, the impact, the blow of the rod was first, and then the heat replaced the blow, and therefore this is considered a michva, which would not join together with shchin. And therefore the shchin and the michva don't join together. O dilma, or perhaps havla kadim, it is the heat that is first, ve'asi chavata, and then the blow that follows, umevatole lahavla, overrides the heat, and now you have, so the blow would be shchin, you have existing shchin with new shchin, each half a shear, they join together to make a whole shear, ve'havale shchin v'shchin umitztarif, and therefore they're both, it's all shchin and it can join together. Okay, great. So that was our Tzaraas exploration. in order for us to arrive at this question of when Shimon gets hit with a red hot rod, and he already has half a shear of Tzaraas, and now he gets a new shear of Tzaraas, right? A new half a shear of Tzaraas. Being, right, so do we consider it like he's first burned and then blowed? Or do we consider like he's first blowed and then burned? The nafkamina being, would the two types of Tzaraas be able to join together to create a shear and make him tummy? Now, Tashma, come in here, that Reb Zera had said at the top of our Gemara, when it comes to Shechita, Amar Reb Zera, Amar Shmuel, Libein Sakin, if a person has a red hot knife, V'shochat ba, and he slaughters with the red hot knife, Shchitasai kshera, Chiduda kodem lilibuna. So the Shechita is kshera because the blow essentially comes before the burn. Right, the Shechita, the blade of the knife was cutting through the neck before the heat of the knife had any impact. So we see that is the blow first, followed by the heat, and therefore, Alma Chabata Kadim. So we see that the blow comes first, and therefore in the case of Tzaraas, it would be Shimon was hit by this red hot rod, and the blow came first, followed by the heat, which means that it would be considered, right, the heat would replace the blow, and it would be considered michva shchin, and would not be able to join together with the shchin. It would be michva Tzaraas, cannot join together with the existing shchin Tzaraas. To which the Gemara says, no, chidud shani. No, it's different in our case, because we're talking about Shechita. That's a knife. A knife is different than a rod. A knife is much thinner and sharper and doesn't retain heat like a rod does. Therefore, I can make the argument that by a knife, the slicing happens before the heat does, because there's less heat happening with the knife and there's more slicing happening. But with a thick rod that is red hot, thick rod, maybe it would retain heat real stark, and maybe the heat would come first there. Tashma, come in here. Libein shapud. If a person makes a rod, a shapud, a skewer, very, very hot, v'hikabo, and he hits with it, nidon mishum michvas eish, he is judged as michvas eish. So we see that the hit comes first, right? Literally, right? Are we not saying that if a person takes a rod that's red hot, hits his friend with it, it will be michvas eish? There you go. It's a burn. So we see that the blow happens first, replaced by the burn. Hasam nami de barzye mivriz mibariz dahainu chidud. No. You could say that is also talking about not where he hit him with the rod, but he skewered him with the rod. He stabbed him with the rod, which would once again be the situation of a blade, of a point, and maybe that is why the blow comes first, because he stabbed him with it rather than hit him. What if he hit him with it? Maybe the burn would come first. So it seems like we kind of leave that question unresolved. But we did learn a whole bunch of interesting things along the way about Tzaraas. Okay, now we are going to move on to for the rest of the daf, we're basically going to have these like smaller, self-contained, important, great little nugget sugyas. So the first important, self-contained, great little nugget sugya is Shechita with a knife used for idolatry. We learned Masechta Avodah Zarah. So anything associated with Avodah Zarah would be Asur Ba'ana. So this knife, so we're focusing on the fact that it's Asur Ba'ana. We're not yet focusing on the fact that maybe it was used for something that was not kosher. We're not focusing on that yet. Right now, the question that we're wondering about is, if this knife is Asur Ba'ana, what can or can't it be used for? So, Omar Rav Nachman, Omar Rabba bar Avua, says Rav Nachman and Rabba bar Avua, Sakin shel avodas kucham, a knife that was used in the service of Avodah Zarah, which is Asur Ba'ana, mutar lishchot ba v'asur lachtoch ba basar. Says Rav Nachman in the name of Rabba bar Avua that this knife that is Asur Ba'ana because it was used in the service of Avodah Zarah, it is mutar lishchot ba. You can use it for shechita. But you can't cut your steak for dinner with it. You can slaughter with it. Mikalkal, because slaughtering is actually a negative thing, potentially. Depends how it's framed. But potentially here, you took an animal, right? When the animal's alive, you have more options. You could plow with it. You can make babies with it. You could eat it. You have all these options. By slaughtering the animal, you've now kind of committed. You lost. You no longer have the options. You're all in. You lost the option to plow with it and to make babies with it. So because that's considered a kind of destructive thing, you're eliminating options. So therefore it is permitted. Right? Because mekalkalu, because it's considered kind of a destructive, an eliminationatory thing. It's you're kind of destroying options, burning bridges. So therefore, it's permitted. You can use this knife that's also bano. But you can't cut your steak for dinner with it. Because that's obviously helpful. That you're clearly getting benefit there using the knife to help you eat your dinner. So that would not be allowed. Oh, my Rava says Rava, but at the same time, everything's relative, right? Depends. Are you getting benefit or are you not getting benefit? So that's really the leading question. So you could also have a situation where the opposite is true, that slaughtering it would be asur, while cutting meat with it would be mutter. There are times when slaughtering would be asur b'misukenes. For example, if you don't slaughter this animal now and eat it, it's going to die. There's no option to plow with it. There's no option to make babies with it. You have a small window to slaughter it and eat it, otherwise you lose it. Well, in that case, you're benefiting by slaughtering it. There's no other way to look at it. And you would not be allowed to use this knife, therefore. And you can have a situation where cutting meat is mutter. Well, for example, if you have, let's say, like a really good cut of meat. You have I don't know, I'm not like a meat guy, so it's like a brisket, like a good cut of, I don't know, is that like a good cut of meat? Why not? A brisket. If it isn't, then let's just pretend like it is, or you could just swap that for whatever cut of meat you like. A brisket. So if you have a brisket, you could say, it's Friday right now, right? I could say, what? I have this brisket. I'm going to go to my close friend, Reb Hillel Lester, and I'm going to say, Reb Hillel, thank you for buying me the Chullin picture book and for helping everybody at Babble on Talmud understand the amazing Masechta Chullin. Here, Hillel, I want you to have this brisket for Shabbos. I could do that. Once I cut it up already, I can't gift it anymore. So in that case, Rava argues. So basically, what we've just described is I can actually give you a scenario where the Shechita would actually be a positive thing. If basically I have to salvage this animal, it's only going to be positive. There's nothing else I can do with it. And cutting meat with it would actually be negative because I lose the opportunity to gift this brisket now that I've cut it up. So in that case, it would be the opposite. Slaughtering would not be allowed. Cutting it would be allowed. Okay, right. The main thing is you're not allowed to get anah from this knife. So as long as you're not getting anah, it'll be okay. Amazing. Okay, so now the Gemara asks the obvious question. If we're talking about a knife that was used for avodah zarah, so doesn't that mean that there's it was used for avodah zarah meat and fat and stuff from the meat that it was previously used for is now going to be getting into whatever meat you're cutting now? Isn't that obviously a problem? Bichadasha. Well, it's talking about an avodah zarah knife that was never actually used. So there was no actual meat, fat, and stuff on the knife. Chadasha, but one second. No, that can't be. Because the knife is not avodah zarah itself. It's not like markulis or anything like that. The knife itself is something used in the service of avodah zarah. If you're gonna slaughter an animal for avodah zarah, so it's machshirei avodah zarah. And when it comes to machshirei avodah zarah, everyone agrees that it isn't asur until you use it. There's a machlekes, right? What does the Gemara say? Bein Rabbi Shmuel, bein Rabbi Kiva, right? Obviously, Avodah Zarah, Daf Nun Aleph Mebez, we all remember. Machlokes Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. When it comes to Avodah Zarah itself, is it also once you've made it before you've worshipped it, or is it only also once you've worshipped it? But when it comes to that's by Avodah Zarah itself. There's a machlekes. Does it wait? And is it only also once you've worshipped it, or maybe even once you've just made it and not yet worshipped it, and immediately becomes asur? But when it comes to machshirei Avodah Zarah, like a knife used for cutting meat for Avodah Zarah, so that would only become asur once you use it. So therefore, right? Because this isn't Avodah Zarah itself; it's a machshirei Avodah Zarah. So therefore, to say that it's a brand new knife, it wouldn't be asur. We're talking about a knife that's asur, so clearly it was used. Okay, chadasha bein Rab Yishmael bein Rab Akiva misham she'avodas kochav min u'misham she'avodas kochav. When it comes to something used in the service of Avodah Zarah, einon asurin ad she ya'avdu, are only going to be asur once they were actually did Avodah Zarah work. And if it's a brand new knife, it would not be asur. Ibai sema. So he says, okay, two answers, two possibilities. One option, de pasak ba gabzel Avodah Zarah. One option is that, sure, the knife was used for Avodah Zarah, but not how you think it was. Not for cutting meat, but for cutting wood. You use this knife for cutting some wood, and so it was used for Avodah Zarah, so it's asur b'ana, but you don't have to be worried about anything non-kosher about it. If you buy same, alternatively, b'yeshana shelibna ba'or. Alternatively, you burnt it, you koshered it in fire. The whole shaila why gets into the interesting show. We won't get into it, but gets an interesting shaila about the last Mishnah Masechta Avodah Zarah about how to kosher things. Do you this knife? Can you just put it in boiling water? Hagala, should hagala be enough? Why does the Gemara say you have to use libun? It's interesting. Tosfos talks about it. Rabbeinu Tam says that maybe this is talking about a big knife that was dafka used as like a skewer. There's a shaila of, but yeah, what if it wasn't a big knife? Do you have to be concerned that maybe they boiled it? I'm sorry, do you have to be concerned that maybe, so if it's not a big knife that was necessarily used as a skewer, do you have to be concerned that maybe they did use it on fire? And anyways, the Rambam says that you have to use fire. You have to do libun. You have to do libun for this knife. Maybe because he says you do have to be concerned that maybe it was used for fire. Anyways, interesting shaila about why exactly you would have to do libun as opposed to agala. But anyways, says the Gemara, nonetheless, if this was a knife that was already used for Avodah Zarah and it was used for meat, so yeah, you would do libun. You would make it red hot over fire, and then right kibolo kachpolto. And then you would be able to use it, and you would have to make sure that you're using it for something that would be permitted, right? That you're not getting, that it would not be considered like you're getting hana'ah from it, or that it would be considered like it's mekalto. And now for the next important self-contained nugget. Itmar was stated, and that is shechita with the knife of a non-Jew. So not Avodah Zarah, but it belonged to a non-Jew, and he was using it for whatever he was using it for. A person who slaughters with a knife belonging to a non-Jew. Rab Amar Kolef, Rab Abachana Amar Madiach. Interesting. So the shechita is fine. No, don't worry. Shechita is okay. Your cow your humongous cow that you were planning to feed your family with for the next 2 years, all good. Don't worry about it. Rav says what you do is you just need to cut away the area around the shechita, right? Any part, it's a cow's a humongous animal. So the where the slice was, any part of the meat of the animal that was touching the knife, you just use a kosher knife and just cut that out, just cut that off. All good. Rabbi Abachaz says all you have to do, you don't even have to do that. Just take some cold water and just wash it off. Just wash off that area, and that is sufficient. Let's say that their machlokes is based on the following. Let's say that their machlokes is about how do we treat the beis hashchita. The beis hashchita is where the slice was sliced. That Rav says that the beis hashchita is considered to be hot, And because the Beis HaShchita is hot, so basically a knife was cutting through hot meat, and the flavor therefore could have exited the knife and been absorbed by that meat. So therefore, you just cut out that meat that was where the slice happened. Whereas Rabbi Bar Chana says the Beis HaShchita is considered to be cold, and therefore the knife was cutting through cold meat, and therefore nothing absorbed anything, and just wash off the area, and then it's completely fine. No. Even Rabbi Bar Chana agrees that the Beis HaShchita is considered hot. I guess technically boiling hot enough that flavor would have exited from the knife and been absorbed into the meat. Manda Omer Kolev Shapir. So according to Rav, who says that you just cut away the neighboring meat, so okay, I get it, because it could have absorbed from the knife. Manda Omer Madiach. Now, according to Rabbi Bar Chana, who says wash it off, even though it's considered hot. Aidi detride simonin la afuke dam lo baloi. Interesting. Since there's right now blood pouring out of the trachea and the esophagus, I don't know, pouring out of the neck. There's right now blood pouring out of the neck. It is in the process of outputting rather than inputting. It's not absorbing flavor now. It is outputting lots and lots of blood. It is not absorbing flavor. To those who say that everyone agrees that the Beis HaShchita is cold. According to one who says just rinse it off with cold water, that's fine. Great, it's cold. The Beis HaShchita is cold. According to Rab, who says that you still have to cut away the neighboring meat because of the pressure on the knife, so it will the meat will absorb, right? So as you're cutting through, as you're slicing through the neck, that meat that is there will absorb from the knife none the less. Tosfos says that this is specifically a principle when it comes to shechita, because he says, right, Tosfos says, "V'dilma beis hashchita davka sheroseach tzas," right? Because we're talking about that everyone agrees that the beis hashchita is cold, but nonetheless, it's still, it's a live animal, so it's still a little bit warm, and the combination of the pressure on the knife as you're slicing through and the fact that the beis hashchita is somewhat warm, it could cause flavor to be absorbed by some of the meat, and therefore Rav says you cut around any meat that is in the beis hashchita that would have touched the knife. And now for the next, important self-contained little nugget. And this is kind of going to be like the final of these kind of things. Shechita with a knife used to slaughter a tereifah. Okay, so we had shechita with a knife used for idolatry, shechita with a knife a knife of a non-Jew. Now shechita with a knife used to slaughter a tereifah. Interesting shaila. So if a shochait slaughters an animal, it turns out it's a tereifah. So basically, just use the knife for treif. So now, can you now go and slaughter the next animal? So, sakin shechachat tereifah, a knife that was used to slaughter a tereifah, plige ba Rav Acha v'Ravina, machlekes Rav Acha Ravina. Of course, we know that whenever there's machlekes Rav Acha and Ravina, I believe it's Ravina. That's always the more lenient opinion. Chad omer b'chamin v'chad omer b'tzonin. One opinion is that the knife needs to go through agala. You got to boil the knife before you can use it again. The other opinion is not. Just rinse it off with cold water, and that's fine. So if you slaughter an animal, turns out it's a tereifah, just rinse off the knife with cold water, and you can use it for the next animal. Ve'ilchsan, the halacha is afilu b'tzonin, you could just rinse it off with cold water. That's fine. Ve'iika blisa de parsa lemichpere lo tzarich, and if there is some kind of a coarse, like curtain, some kind of coarse cloth that you can use to just wipe down the knife, that's also completely fine. You don't even need to wash it then. My time. Now, according to the opinion who says that it needs hagala, you'd have to boil the shechita knife once it was used for a tereifah. How come you have to boil it? Mishum the kabbalah isura. So the Gemara asks a very interesting question. So if you say that you have to boil the knife, how come you have to have hagala? How come you have to kasher it? Well, because the animal, it turns out it was a tereifah. And as you're slicing through the neck, it's going to be absorbing treif. So therefore you have to do agala. Well, de'atera nami. The Gemara has a very interesting question. Of course, we know that aver min achai is osir, right? An animal, when it's alive, is osir. And therefore, de'atera nami, as you're slicing through the neck, bala aver min achai, as you're slicing through the neck, before you've sliced through a majority of the trachea and the esophagus, before it's a kosher shechita, the knife will be absorbing aver min achai from a live animal. So if you're going to say that by a tereifah, you have to do agala on the knife because it absorbed from the treif animal, well, even by a kosher animal, as it's cutting through, it's absorbing aver min achai until finally you've completed the shechita. But shouldn't you have to do agala to get to release the aver min achai from the knife? To which the Gemara says, Eimas bala. One second. When is the knife going to absorb anything? Whether the tereifah, whether the aver min achai. L'chichaima, when it gets hot, it will absorb. Amos kachaima, and when does it get hot? L'chigamer shechita, at the end of the shechita is when there's the maximum heat. Ha'u shaita de hetera hava. And at the end of the shechita, the animal's ready mutter. So by the tereifah, by the end of the shechita, the animal's still treif, and the knife is absorbing treif. By the end of a kosher shechita, by that point, the animal is now kosher, and it's absorbing kosher. So therefore, there's no question about aver min achai from before it was a kosher shechita while it was still slicing, because at that point it wasn't considered hot enough for it to have absorbed. And now we will wrap up this daf, not quite yet, but this is kind of the last section of the daf, with some laws for a shochait, kind of miscellaneous laws that are not related directly to shechita, but are kind of halachas that a shochait should know. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rab, hatabach, a shochait, tzarich shalosh sakinin, he needs 3 knives. Achas sheshochet ba, 1 for shechita. He has to have a bespoke knife, a knife that he uses for shechita alone, because if he uses it for anything else, he can get if you go to, and then he goes eat lunch and he's using his shechita knife, he can get a nick in it or something like that, and he needs to make sure that it is going to be sharp and kosher for shechita. So that's a dedicated knife for shechita. And then after the shechita, he's going to be cutting up the animal. So he's going to be cutting up the meat with a second knife. And for dealing with any chaylev, he's going to be using a separate knife for dealing with chaylev, which of course are forbidden fats. So he needs 3 knives. Wait, why can't you just have 1 knife for both the chaylev and the meat? First, cut the meat with it, and then afterwards cut the chaylev. Just you can use 1 knife. Just use it first for the meat, and then afterwards for the chaylev, so that when you're using the meat, it hasn't yet been used for the chaylev. But why do you need a separate knife for the chaylev? Well, we're concerned that maybe if you only have 1 knife, then you might first use it for the chaylev and then for the basar. Well, 1 second, we could still be concerned that even when you have dedicated knives, you might take the wrong knife. Since he needs to bring separate, since he has multiple knives, so he marks which knife is which, and it will be clear to him which knife to use. So therefore he needs 3 knives, 1 for shechita, 1 for cutting up the meat, and 1 for cutting out chaylev. V'amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rab, and says Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rab, hatabach tzarich shnei kelim shel mayim. He needs 2 buckets of water. Echad shemadiach bo basar. In one of the buckets of water, he rinses the meat. The echad shemadiach bo chalavim, and in one of them he's washing the fats, the chalav and the chaylev. Why not just have 1 bucket of nadiach bo basar, other nadiach bo chalavim? Why not have 1 bucket? First use it for meat, and then afterwards you can use it for the chaylev. We're concerned that maybe he will first rinse the chaylev and then the meat, and you're going to get chaylev, sediments on the meat. Hashtanami michal filet, but shouldn't we be concerned that you might use the wrong bucket, right? You might end up putting the meat in the chaylev bucket or whatever. No, since you require 2 separate buckets, so they will be identifiable, and you will know you will be able to see what you're doing and do the right thing. And now the final section of the daf, and the first time we are going to be using pictures from our friend Rabbi Hillel's gift to all of us. Now, says the Gemara, Amr Ameimer says Ameimer Mishmeder Apopet lo lischov inish kafle ilave bisra. The da'iv tarba uvala bisra. Okay, let's take a look at this slide. So on this slide, as the title says, the flanks with the chaylev. So on the photo on the left, you can't. So what's the photo on the left? So that looks like it's probably a lamb or a goat or something. Maybe it's a goat. I don't know. It's probably a lamb or a goat. And so there are some arrows there. There's the upper two arrows and the lower two arrows. So that looks like it's a goat that is hanging by its feet. So the bottom over there is its neck. The bottom of the photo is its neck. And it's been cut open from its like belly button down to its chest. And you could see in there, so the lower two arrows, you can see it's labeled as klayot. Those are the kidneys. The reason why I have this photo here is because I want to be able to show that there's those kind of kidneys under there. And then these are the upper two arrows are labeled as chaylev aklayot. These are the chaylev that's on top of the kidneys. So you can see the white. So, we've been talking about chaylev, right, for a long time. I'd say probably since maybe since Masechta Shavuos, we probably started talking about chaylev, I imagine, more. I don't know. But we've been talking about chaylev for a long time. And so we could actually see what it looks like, thanks to our friend Reb Hillel. And so the chaylev is all that white fat on the kidneys, and you can see the kidneys. That's the left photo. Now, if we look at the top right photo, so we could see once again so it labels there those as the klayot, right? The bottom, you can see this, right? If you look, you can see basically there's two things there. There's two arrows are pointing to the ksalim, the flanks. The flanks are like the meat, right? You can see that on the top right photo. On the right side of the photo, there's like some meat that's kind of like opened up, like flapped open. And then in the middle, there's that two white stuff. And those are both labeled as klayot. Now, in this photo, the top right photo, you don't really actually see the kidneys, which is why I included the left photo so you can actually see the kidneys, and that's the chaylev on top of the kidneys. But okay, so in this photo, on the top right, so you see all the kidney chaylev, the chaylev aklayot, and you see the flanks. The flanks are the meat on the sides of the kidneys that I guess like fold over. I guess like when you slit the goat, let's say, open from feet to chest. So you had those flanks are like the meat, I guess, underneath there that open up. And okay, so there is the flanks, and there is the kidneys, the fat, the chaylev of the kidneys. And you see how they're in close proximity to each other. And the bottom right photo, you see somebody, I think it's probably a computer-generated somebody, but this computer-generated somebody is pulling some kind of what's the word? Some kind. I don't know. A krum. How do you define it? Some kind of a layer. Essentially, I have to get a better word for that. But there's some kind of a membrane. A membrane is probably the right thing. So he's pulling some kind of a membrane from the flank, from the ksalim. The point being that there is a membrane separating between the flank and the chaylev, such that the chaylev would not melt into the flank, since there is the membrane separating them. Okay. That being said, let us look at the Gemara. So Amar Meimar says, Meimar Mishmeder Papa lo nischof inish kafle ilave bisra. So the top right photo is really what we're concerned with. This flank, together with the chaylev haklayos, with this chaylev, the flank with the chaylev, don't lie that on top of like a steak. The da'iv tarba, because the chaylev is going to melt, uvala bisra, and the steak is going to absorb the chaylev, and that's bad. But if that's the case, then even if you just lie down the meat like we see in the top right photo, when it's just lying there, shouldn't we be concerned that the chaylev is going to melt into the flank? Karma mafsik mitatoy, but like we can see in the bottom right photo, there is a thick membrane that is going to prevent the chaylev from being absorbed by the meat of the flank. If that's the case, may ilai nami. But 1 second, even when you take the chaylev and you place it on top of a steak, a karma ika, the chaylev itself has, albeit a thin membrane, but some kind of membrane as well. I did mashmisha yada de tabacha miftas. Well, when the shochait is going to be interacting and touching and moving things around and holding the meat and touching the chaylev, that membrane it's a very thin membrane. It's basically going to become irrelevant, and we have to be concerned that the chaylev is going to get into the steak. Masha enkein, by the flank that has a thicker membrane, and we don't have to be concerned about the chaylev getting into the flank meat. Okay, so therefore, advice to the butchers not to leave the flank with the chaylev face down on a steak. Friends, that was Daf 8 of Masechta Chullin. Wow, so on Daf 8, I think it did end up being a long Daf. I mean, that's generally the rule of thumb. Lots of sections, takes a long time, even if it feels like it's not necessarily so hard or whatever. Although we did have that big Tzaraas sugya in the middle. Al Kopanim. So the first section of today's Daf, we discussed Shechita with a red hot knife. We said, the Shechita is kosher because the cut is happening before the burn happens, and the pipe pulls away as it's being sliced through, so there isn't even a concern about the sides of the knife causing any burn damage as it's slicing through, because that's just kind of being pulled away. It's tightly wound, and as it's sliced, it gets pulled in different directions. We then discussed what the implications are for Tzaraas from a red hot rod, right? Because it's a similar question, right? If you get hit with a red hot rod, what happens first? The hit, just like the slice happens first, or the heat? So it was kind of, and there's nafkaminas. We talked about Tzaraas ashchin or hamichva, and we talked about the details of those in terms of the two white hairs and the spreading and how it's only 1 week, and we kind of made some seder there with Tzaraas, but in the end, it was a bit inconclusive. We discussed shechita with a knife used for idolatry. So it's kosher when it's not getting benefit, and it's not kosher when it is getting benefit. So for example, you can use it to slaughter an animal when by slaughtering the animal, you're basically burning bridges. You can no longer plow with it. You can no longer make babies with it. You're kind of limiting your options by slaughtering it, so that is permitted. You wouldn't be allowed to cut up a steak with it, because then you're benefiting from this avodah zarah knife. Though there could be situations when it's, basically the point is, if you're getting benefit, it's not allowed. If you're not getting benefit, it is allowed. What about the fact that the knife is not kosher? So we gave 2 options there. Either it was never actually used for meat, it was used for cutting wood. Alternatively, you koshered it in a fire with libun, and therefore that you koshered it. We discussed shechita with the knife of a non-Jew. We say, first of all, it's kosher. Rav says you cut away the meat surrounding the slice, and Rabba Bar Chana says you simply wash off the area around the slice. I think we said that you can. No. Okay, fine, great. Next, shechita with a knife used to slaughter a tereifah. Rav Acha and Ravina, one of them says you boil, right? So if you slaughter an animal with a knife, turns out the animal is a tereifah. So what do you do with the fact that you just use the knife for a treif? So one opinion is you have to boil the knife in water. The other opinion is you just rinse it in cold water, and even wiping it off with a stiff curtain is fine. And then some assorted laws about, right, for a shochait, use 3 knives, 1 for shechita, 1 for chaylev, 1 for the meat, 2 buckets of water, 1 for chaylev and 1 for meat, and don't rest the flanks with the chaylev on top of meat. Friends, that was Daf 8 of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Have a great Shabbos. Cheers.